Barack Obama, the absolute greatest political orator of our modern era, found himself completely unable to finish a single sentence after J.D. Vance confronted him directly by reading an internal document authored by his own administration, which was intended to remain permanently hidden within the highest office. For the very first time in his entire public existence, the former president possessed absolutely nothing to say. He began by declaring he wanted to address the fundamental reasons, bringing everyone into that specific room, and the core motivations driving individuals from all political backgrounds toward public service. Barack Obama sat at the table projecting the exact physical posture of a gracious host, presiding over a formal dinner gathering. He leaned back comfortably, resting one hand on the table surface and placing the other casually on the arm of his chair. He distributed his physical weight with the effortless grace of a man who had occupied rooms of this magnitude significantly more times than the vast majority of individuals sitting across from him had even been involved in government. His vocal delivery commenced at the exact volume level where most other voices typically fade away. He utilized a highly specific register that perfectly filled the massive space without ever requiring him to raise his volume, projecting his words easily to the distant back wall without any noticeable physical push. This was the specific vocal register he had spent an entire lifetime learning to master and occupy completely exactly the way a brilliant musician fully inhabits a musical key. He stated they were gathered there because of a shared belief that government institutions can serve as a powerful force for collective good. He emphasized this was absolutely not a partisan ideology, but rather a fundamental national belief. He then admitted that he had navigated his long career imperfectly, exactly as all human beings inevitably do. He deliberately paused immediately following that specific word. That calculated silence functioned as an invisible door he graciously held open, allowing the entire room to walk through it. It served as a masterful invitation for everyone to witness his manufactured willingness to openly admit his personal flaws. A political reporter seated in the second row instantly leaned forward by half an inch, simply because leaning forward was the automatic physical reaction everyone exhibited whenever Obama deployed one of his signature silences. Continuing his effort to live up to those high ideals, he claimed he always believed that maintaining an honest, transparent accounting of their historical successes alongside their failures remained absolutely essential for the overall health of the democratic system. Therefore, he graciously welcomed this ongoing conversation. He casually dismissed his massive historical record as merely imperfect. However, the opposing official possessed 7 of those specific imperfections thoroughly documented, with exact dates and direct quotes, and the harsh reality of what actually occurred. He also possessed one highly confidential electronic message originating from inside the highest office that the administrative staff desperately wanted to keep permanently concealed. J.D. Vance sat with his shirt sleeves rolled up practically to his forearms and his reading glasses positioned firmly on the bridge of his nose. A thick stack of printed papers rested directly in front of him, completely untouched at this moment. He remained perfectly still in his designated chair, mirroring his usual composed posture with both hands, resting flat upon the table, and his palms facing downward without any unnecessary movement. When he finally initiated his response, his vocal volume was so incredibly quiet that the amplification microphone was forced to work exceptionally hard just to capture his words. He addressed the former president by stating he wanted to begin by sharing a personal revelation that the leader might absolutely not expect to hear. He lifted his gaze from the stacked documents and looked directly into the eyes of Obama. This intense visual directness served as its own powerful statement, because the vast majority of individuals who sat across from this specific leader typically stared down at the table or looked toward the camera lenses or heavily relied upon their notes. But Vance maintained unbroken eye contact. He boldly confessed that he had actively cast his ballot to elect the leader during the 2008 historical cycle. The chin of the former president elevated by a barely perceptible millimeter. His eyebrows shifted in a microscopic reaction that only the closest broadcasting lenses managed to capture. Vance explained he was simply a struggling youth, residing in Middletown, Ohio. He detailed his incredibly difficult upbringing, noting his mother constantly battled severe personal issues requiring frequent residential treatment. He shared that his grandmother, whom he affectionately called Mama, was forced to raise him on a meager wage of $11 per hour. Their living conditions were incredibly humble, featuring heavily stained carpets and a broken screen door that constantly refused to latch properly. He recalled watching the charismatic politician stand on a massive stage, delivering soaring rhetoric about magnificent hope and sweeping change. He admitted with total vulnerability that he completely believed those promises. He paused momentarily. This was not a calculated political silence, nor an invisible door being held open. It was simply the quiet pause of a man processing heavy memories. He shared that numerous forgotten citizens in his struggling community completely believed those beautiful words. Individuals who had entirely abandoned the voting process for many years, and people who had completely given up on the entire political system, suddenly returned. He noted the leader successfully brought all of those citizens back into the fold and achieved that massive mobilization using absolutely nothing but his soaring words. Resting his hand firmly upon the thick stack of documents, he declared his current presence in that room was directly driven by those exact words. He smoothly extracted the first page from the pile. He referenced a specific statement made in the middle of June 2009. He reminded the leader of his absolute guarantee to the public that they could permanently keep their preferred medical professionals and retain their existing health coverage plans if they were satisfied with them. He recited this historical quote, slowly, intentionally mimicking the spacious architectural rhythm of the original speaker. He did not exactly imitate the vocal tone, but rather borrowed its structural pauses and its massive spaciousness. It looked exactly like a person awkwardly trying to wear a borrowed suit that entirely fails to fit them correctly and hangs loosely in all the wrong places. After carefully setting the document aside, his voice instantly reverted back to the flat, unmusical reality of his industrial hometown. It contained absolutely no soaring melodies. It sounded exactly like an exhausted customer reading a highly disappointing commercial receipt to verify the terrible total. He bluntly delivered the crushing truth that 5 million citizens subsequently received official cancellation notices regarding their medical policies. He highlighted that a prominent, nonpartisan fact-checking organization entirely unassociated with conservative politics officially designated that exact promise as the absolute most massive falsehood of the year 2000 and perpetuity. 13. He placed that page down and retrieved the subsequent document. The terrifying rhythm of the interrogation was becoming undeniably visible. It involved the slow extraction of a document, followed by a reading utilizing two distinctly different vocal tones, and ended with the physical placement of the paper onto the table. The highly predictable visibility of this ritual significantly amplified its destructive psychological power. By the time he reached the third or fourth page, the entire room instinctively knew exactly what was approaching before he even spoke the words. This intense anticipation absolutely did not diminish the eventual impact, but rather deepened the devastation. He moved to a statement from the very first full day of the new administration, where the leader guaranteed the establishment of the most transparent governing body in national history. He delivered this concept utilizing the borrowed, slow, and highly presidential rhythm, giving the words ample room to breathe. Switching back to his bare industrial tone, he exposed the brutal reality. He stated that this supposedly transparent administration aggressively prosecuted more individuals who exposed internal secrets under espionage statutes than every single prior administration in national history combined. He heavily emphasized that this completely surpassed all of them combined. Furthermore, the Federal Justice Department secretly confiscated 2 entire months of communication records from a major press organization. He detailed how federal investigators officially designated a prominent news reporter as a criminal co-conspirator simply for executing his professional journalistic duties of asking questions. A journalist seated in the press area completely froze, her fingers hovering awkwardly above her keyboard, entirely suspended in the air between words and completely unable to continue typing. He turned to a promise from early in the administration, guaranteeing relentless effort until every single citizen seeking employment secured a proper job. Transitioning to his flat delivery, he described the devastating reality of his hometown, where the massive Armco steel plant historically served as the primary economic engine. He noted his grandmother worked there alongside half the local population. Historically, a local youth could easily graduate high school on a Friday and immediately secure a fully benefited position by Monday morning. However, that vital facility permanently shut down its final production line during that specific presidency. Instead of reliable employment, the community was flooded with highly dangerous restricted medications. Prescriptions for these destructive substances completely tripled in Butler County during his tenure. The reliable manufacturing jobs vanished, while the dangerous narcotics poured into the community, utilizing the exact same transit routes and delivery trucks that previously transported manufactured steel directly to the exact same residential neighborhoods. He bluntly informed the former president that while he absolutely failed to work tirelessly to save those industrial jobs, he certainly delivered numerous beautiful speeches regarding the topic. Without allowing the audience any time to emotionally process the tragedy, he immediately turned to the next page. This document highlighted a declaration promising an absolute end to ignoring legal boundaries simply because they were politically inconvenient. The brutal counterpoint involved a highly controversial federal initiative where the Justice Department deliberately allowed 2,000 weapons to cross the southern border, falling directly into the hands of dangerous illicit syndicates under the guise of tracking them. Predictably, the federal agents completely lost track of the weapons. Tragically, one of those specific weapons was discovered at a crime scene where a dedicated Border Patrol agent was fatally injured on domestic soil. When congressional investigators demanded answers, the Attorney General flatly refused to produce the documents, claiming executive privilege. This resulted in a rare bipartisan contempt resolution against the top justice official. Vance delivered the devastating final detail, noting that over 14 years later, the grieving mother of the fallen agent still lacks a complete factual accounting of how her son lost his life. An elderly military veteran wearing a distinctive cap pressed his hands deeply into his knees, completely unable to look away from the intense confrontation. The fifth document referenced a highly publicized promise to permanently shut down the controversial detention facility located at Guantanamo Bay. Vance offered only a brutal reality check, stating flatly that it remains fully open. He did not elaborate further, simply turning to the next page. The sixth page highlighted a pledge demanding all administrative policy be driven by factual evidence rather than political ideology. Vance exposed how the Federal Revenue Service, operating under appointed leadership, actively targeted specific conservative organizations applying for tax-exempt status. Any groups utilizing patriotic terms or specific historical references in their names were deliberately singled out for intense scrutiny and incredibly intrusive questioning. The official directly responsible for this ideological targeting was called before congressional investigators, but she entirely refused to answer a single inquiry invoking her constitutional protections against self-incrimination. Reaching the final page of the initial sequence, he held the document for a fraction of a second longer than the others. He ran his thumb across the edge of the paper in a small, unconscious gesture, indicating the deep personal discomfort of a man holding something he absolutely despises having to present. The promise declared that the nation never leaves its people behind, framing it as a core national identity. Speaking with a very quiet and serious tone, Vance revealed the horrific tragedy at a medical facility in Phoenix. He detailed how numerous military veterans lost their lives while waiting for medical attention that was maliciously scheduled on a heavily guarded secret registry. This hidden list was deliberately maintained alongside the official documentation simply to create the artificial illusion of shorter wait times for government reporting purposes. A subsequent federal audit uncovered that 57,000 enrolled veterans requested appointments but never received them, while 1,600 suffered through wait times exceeding 90 days. He carefully set the page down and personalized this massive institutional failure. He noted that the neighbors of his grandmother relied entirely on that exact medical system. These courageous men who bravely served in dangerous overseas conflicts returned home only to be completely deceived by the country they fought for. They sat in clinical waiting rooms for agonizing months, while the hospital administrators blatantly lied about how long they had been waiting for basic care. He then carefully arranged the 7 individual pages into a perfectly straight horizontal line across the dark wooden table, creating a stark visual timeline of massive broken promises. This row of white rectangles stretched far across the surface, representing the massive distance between soaring rhetorical promises and brutal governing realities. He summarized the absolute devastation, noting that while the administration promised magnificent hope, his hometown received an influx of deadly narcotics. They promised sweeping change, but the only actual change involved functional factories degrading into abandoned empty structures surrounded by weed-filled parking lots. He reminded the former leader of his promise to never rest, concluding that the only individuals who truly never rested were the local citizens, endlessly waiting for the promised change, while the leadership team simply traveled the country, delivering empty speeches about it. Recognizing the severe historical damage, the former president aggressively altered his physical posture. He transitioned from a relaxed observer to a fierce advocate, moving from resting against the back of his chair to leaning heavily into the microphone. The entire weight of his body shifted toward the room, preparing for a massive defensive strike. When he finally spoke, his vocal register had dropped significantly, finding that particular depth he always utilized when he needed to remind an audience exactly why they had granted him ultimate executive authority and control of the strategic defensive codes. He began by politely appreciating the personal narrative shared by his interrogator. He then executed another masterful dramatic pause. The calculated silence created a massive gravitational pull, forcing reporters and attendees to physically lean forward by half an inch. This was the undeniable power of his signature silences, generating immense atmospheric gravity. He launched a passionate defense regarding the immense difficulty of actual governance, arguing it remains the hardest task in existence. He claimed the massive gap between campaign promises and final policy is absolutely not a failure of personal character, but rather represents the complex width of democratic systems. He argued it is a space entirely filled with complex legislative compromises and the harsh reality that absolutely no historical leader manages to deliver every single promise they make. He built rhetorical momentum by repeating this concept, letting each word land heavier than the last. Listing revered figures like Lincoln and Roosevelt and Reagan before including himself. He insisted the true judgment of history relies entirely upon whether the overarching trajectory of progress was actively bending toward eventual justice, regardless of how slowly or imperfectly it moved. Straightening his spine to punctuate his aggressive defense, he boldly challenged anyone to compare his historical record against any other administration. He proudly highlighted providing health coverage to 20 million previously uninsured citizens, successfully pulling the massive economy back from the terrifying edge of a secondary depression and securing an international agreement that prevented nuclear proliferation without sacrificing a single Essenja domestic casualty. He forcefully stated he would confidently place that massive record against absolutely any administration in modern history. Following that specific phrase, he unleashed his most powerful tool, holding the room in absolute silence for 3 entirely unbroken seconds. It was a beautifully calibrated and heavily loaded pause, designed exactly to make the audience hold their collective breath, because they knew the subsequent sentence would land with immense historical weight. An allied staff member sat up noticeably straighter, while a journalist eagerly resumed documenting the historical moment. Vance patiently waited for the frantic writing to completely cease before delivering a devastating factual correction. He acknowledged the 20 million who gained coverage, but immediately highlighted the 5 million who completely lost their preferred plans despite explicit promises to the contrary. He accused the former president of only counting the individuals he successfully helped while completely ignoring the massive demographic he actively deceived. Picking up one of the previous pages, he declared he was simply reading the names of the citizens who were lied to. The frantic writing instantly stopped, and the allied staff member lost their confident posture. Vance then reached entirely beneath his stack and produced a highly unique single-page document. This paper featured a different premium texture and prominently displayed an official internal seal in blue ink, indicating it was deeply confidential communication absolutely never meant for public press conferences. He identified it as a highly classified internal administrative memorandum generated exactly 2 months prior to the massive public healthcare launch. It was directly transmitted from a senior policy advisor straight to the highest-ranking chief of staff. Adjusting his reading glasses, he recited the contents with methodical dictation speed, letting each individual clause land like heavy weights upon a balancing scale, adding massive pressure with every spoken word. The internal document explicitly warned that continuing to use the promise regarding keeping personal plans would become a massive problem because internal projections proved between 5 and 8 million citizens would absolutely receive cancellation notices within the initial 90 days. Vance looked up immediately, emphasizing that this massive numerical projection came directly from internal personnel rather than partisan opponents or outside analytical groups. It was his own people, providing his own specific numbers. Returning to the document, he read the strategic recommendation, which desperately pleaded with the leadership to immediately cease using the false statement, or, at the very minimum, add a qualifying caveat, modifying the absolute language to, say, most people. Instead of everyone, the advisors warned that ignoring this reality would create significant legal and political exposure. Setting that page down, he retrieved a small paragraph containing the final response from the chief of staff. His voice dropped to a near whisper, projecting the tone of a man deeply saddened by what he was forced to read in front of the person who originally authored the deception. The response confirmed that the president personally reviewed the warning, but deliberately chose to keep the false statement exactly as it was, simply because it currently polled at a massive 78% favorability rating. He paused briefly before reading the final justifying sentence, which stated bluntly that if they added the truthful caveat, they would entirely ruin the core message. In the absolute silence following this horrific revelation, the fluorescent lighting above hummed loudly. A small writing instrument rolled off a desk in the press area and hit the carpeted floor, making a tiny round sound that served as the only physical movement in the entire room for an agonizingly long period of time. Vance placed this final document at the end of the long row, classifying it as the ultimate key that perfectly explained all the preceding administrative failures. He repeated the damning phrase regarding losing the message, ensuring it was permanently recorded into the historical transcript for future generations long after the cameras powered down. He completely dismantled any potential defense, stating his own staff explicitly told him the promise was entirely false. They did not merely suggest or hint at the problem, they delivered a formally sealed document containing massive cancellation numbers and begged him to stop spreading the deception. They provided a highly reasonable alternative, asking him to simply utilize the phrase "most people" instead of issuing an absolute guarantee. It only required a single word to fix the massive lie. Removing his glasses and setting them atop the stack, he exposed the horrific reality of the executive response. He noted the response was absolutely not a desire to fix the problem or a commitment to owing the public the truth. The response was exclusively focused on maintaining the high polling numbers. He looked directly at Obama, stating he did not accidentally misspeak or oversimplify a complex bureaucratic issue. He was explicitly warned in writing by his own trusted personnel that the core promise was completely false, and he actively chose to keep repeating it, because the deception tested significantly better in focus groups than the actual truth. 5 million citizens lost their medical stability simply because a positive poll number was deemed vastly more important than basic honesty. The former president completely broke under the intense pressure. His left hand, which had remained perfectly still since the hearing commenced, quickly moved below the visible camera line to clutch his knee. His right hand nervously adjusted his necktie by a tiny margin barely visible to the naked eye. This was the very first instance all morning where he required any physical adjustment. For a man universally renowned for his absolute physical discipline and total lack of nervous fidgeting, this incredibly small adjustment was a massive psychological tell. It signaled the complete physical breakdown of an individual who had completely exhausted all available options for remaining composed. His internal team had explicitly provided the massive cancellation numbers, and his only response was prioritizing the political message. He absolutely did not misspeak. He deliberately chose the favorable polling numbers over absolute truth. Remaining firmly seated, Vance refused to act like an aggressive prosecuting attorney, delivering a dramatic closing argument. He maintained the humble persona of a youth from an industrial town, sitting across from a leader he once deeply admired, ensuring the physical dynamics remained entirely level. He acknowledged the man sitting across from him was undeniably the greatest rhetorical speaker of multiple generations, possessing an incredible gift for making audiences truly believe in abstract concepts like hope. He gestured slightly, acknowledging the immense power of his vocal delivery. Pausing strictly for memory rather than dramatic effect, he shared a deeply personal recollection. He recalled watching those powerful speeches with his grandmother on a severely malfunctioning television set that required physical manipulation just to secure a basic picture. He remembered his grandmother stating that the man spoke so incredibly beautifully that it naturally made people completely forget to verify if he was actually telling the truth. Allowing those profound words to rest heavily beside the damning documentation, Vance revealed he finally took the time to verify the historical record. He found a massive collection of broken promises and a highly confidential memorandum, proving the administration actively chose deception because it tested better with audiences. He rapidly summarized the comprehensive failures, contrasting the soaring rhetoric of hope against the brutal realities of urban decay and medical waiting lists and institutional deception. He noted his grandmother passed away in a forgotten neighborhood, heavily featured in beautiful political speeches, but entirely ignored by actual policies. He shared her final piece of profound wisdom, which advised him to constantly observe the actions of powerful people rather than blindly trusting their beautiful words. Folding his glasses and setting them down with a sharp, audible click, he concluded that he had carefully observed the historical actions, finding nothing but beautifully crafted speeches, masking entirely broken promises. He folded his hands calmly, stating he had nothing further to add. When the managing chairman offered the former president an opportunity to deliver a final rebuttal, he opened his mouth and attempted to deploy another one of his signature silences. He utilized the exact same duration and breathing pattern that previously commanded absolute attention. However, the rhetorical magic was entirely broken. The journalist who previously leaned forward completely ignored the pause, remaining perfectly still alongside her colleagues. The entire room intuitively recognized that a silence containing profound wisdom pulls people forward, but an empty silence leaves them entirely unaffected. The collective physical bodies in the room understood this fundamental shift long before their logical minds processed it. Attempting to formulate a coherent thought, his eyes drifted aimlessly toward the middle distance, testing various words behind his teeth, before ultimately rejecting them as insufficient. The absolute master of the English language, who previously delivered massive addresses without any notes and easily manipulated the emotional temperature of entire arenas, was reduced to a pathetic 6-word defense. He weakly stated that he stands by the work they did, leaving massive, awkward spaces between each individual word. Those massive gaps represented the tragic distance between a brilliant speaker choosing a dramatic pause and a broken man who had absolutely nothing left to say. The broadcast footage exploded instantly, surpassing 70 million views within a single week, as audiences watched the greatest living orator realize his legendary rhetorical instrument was entirely broken. A concise 50-second variation highlighting the internal document circulated globally across all major platforms, serving as premium political entertainment. However, the complete 16-minute version was typically consumed in private isolation, causing millions of former supporters to painfully question their own historical beliefs behind closed doors. The immediate political fallout was incredibly severe, resulting in a formal congressional inquiry and massive subpoenas targeting all internal messaging documents. Despite facing no direct legal peril, the former leader became highly politically toxic. Multiple allied politicians completely refused to appear alongside him, with one prominent figure deliberately sitting several seats away from his assigned empty chair. That exact evening, a military veteran named James watched the entire broadcast alone in his Ohio living room. Like Vance, he had enthusiastically voted for the administration, driven entirely by the desperate youth-driven need to believe in hope and sweeping change, before fully understanding the brutal cost of political promises. He subsequently deployed for 2 brutal military tours in incredibly dangerous foreign territories, returning with severe spinal injuries and permanent hearing damage. He endured 14 agonizing months of bureaucratic delay, constantly listening to recorded classical hold music while desperately trying to secure vital medical appointments. Hearing the tragic statistics regarding the veterans who lost their lives while waiting, he stared at his own hands, remembering the massive pain of his incredibly long delay. He realized he survived the bureaucratic nightmare, but completely lost his faith in the political system. He quietly closed his laptop, existing as a man who was entirely finished believing in political miracles. Meanwhile, Vance sat quietly in his official office, writing the simple truth that his grandmother was absolutely correct on a standard yellow legal pad, feeling absolutely no need to underline the profound realization. Simultaneously, sitting in a highly luxurious private residence surrounded by expensive furnishings, the former president found himself entirely unable to write. He historically utilized the writing process to navigate massive crises and make sense of the complex world. But this time, absolutely no clarity arrived. He stared blankly at empty pages, finally realizing his rhetorical instrument was not broken, but rather his ear was permanently damaged. He could never unhear the profound wisdom of an impoverished grandmother from Ohio, recognizing that the entire country had finally checked his record and discovered the massive deception. If you want more content exploring these incredible political moments, leave a specific engagement word below, and share this narrative widely with others, seeking absolute clarity regarding broken promises.